All right. Good morning, Kara. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Good. So, um, this is probably our second session. And for our first session, we did an initial interview and we discussed some options for an assessment for you to take. And if you remember, you took the MMPI. And it was a bunch of true, false questions that you answered. Do you remember taking this assessment?
Yes,
Okay.
I remember taking this assessment, and it was last week.
All right. Do you remember how you felt during the assessment? Any type of feelings that you were experiencing?
I had taken different personality tests before in school. I had never taken the MMPI, but I was excited to take it, but I was also kind of nervous just because it's a really long test, and even though it's only true and false, it's still kind of like a lot of stuff all at once. So
Right.
I just hope that I did it right, even though I know there's probably not a right or wrong answer. I just hoped I completed it correctly.
Yeah. So it's very normal to be maybe like a little overwhelmed, especially with all those questions. But yes, you did complete it correctly. I took the time to assess your results. And just to kind of let you know that when I do go over your results and go over the interpretation of your results, please make sure that you feel free to make comments at any time. That I just want to stress to you that this is a collaborative effort, and that the more you put into this, the more you're going to get out of it per se. So if you could just keep that in mind while we go through this process. If you do have any questions, or if there's anything that kind of stands out to you, I will be periodically checking in on you and seeing, what you feel. Do you agree with the data, or what do you disagree about? And just it's overall collaborative effort.
Okay, that sounds great.
All right, awesome. So, I do want to point out that I realize this process might be uncomfortable. I will do my best to alleviate those feelings, but I do understand if you have feelings of being anxious and nervous. But I do appreciate you being here, taking the time to do the assessment and to follow through with coming up with a treatment plan based on those results. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so the overall structure of how this is going to work today, that I'm going to give you the results of the MMPI that you took, and we kind of briefly talked about it. It's that personality assessment, which the purpose of is to evaluate your any kind of mental disorders, or taking the steps for treatment to accommodate those disorders. I do want to remind you again that this assessment is to describe personality traits. It's not used to diagnose any personality disorders. For instance, when I get to what's called clinical scales, there's these different types of clinical scales that will talk about, specific disorders. For example, there's a clinical scale that talks about, or that's labeled schizophrenia. For our purposes, I'm just going to refer to the clinical scales by their number, not necessarily their name. Some clients can be thrown off by the clinical scale name. For instance, number 8, which is a schizophrenia scale. This describes behaviors of schizophrenia. It doesn't diagnose schizophrenia, if that makes sense to you. So
Yes.
I will try to avoid that type of confusion just by referring to these scales by their number.
Okay.
Okay? All right, awesome. So before we get to those clinical scales, I do want to talk a little bit about the validity scales. So this assessment is unique where it has what's called these validity scales. And they're used to determine if a client is completing the assessment in a valid manner. So, for example, it gives a counselor a heads up if a client may be dishonest or responding to questions in a way that contradicts themselves. So I will say that your validity scores overall suggest that you most likely answered the questions honestly and to the best of your ability. So that's pretty encouraging for me as your counselor to see. Would you agree with that or disagree?
Yes, no, I was definitely honest throughout the test. I feel like if anything would have maybe altered my results, it was probably just because I was nervous.
Right, right. Okay, yeah. Also, with your ability scales, it's illustrating that you were able to admit to personal, emotional problems, that you do need help, and that you are unsure of your abilities to deal with those problems. So, would that be something that you agree or maybe disagree with?
Yeah, for the most part, that is kind of how I feel. Like it's mainly just a lot of emotions all at once. And I think that's the reason why I can't really express them or work through them is just because it feels extremely overbearing to think about so many emotions and feelings at one time. So I seem to kind of just shut down instead.
Right, right. Yes. Um, Great. Yes. Thank you for reiterating that. Good. Okay. So we just went over the